I haven't time for your grisly jokes.
Joan Crawford is remembered as discipline made visible, controlled,
They don't write for ladies anymore, but I have news for you. We're here to stay.
precise,
After this picture.
Are you kidding? Who, me? Never.
unyielding.
Fantastic. It's hard work, but I wouldn't give it up for anything in the world.
A woman who survived Hollywood by mastering its rules before they mastered her.
One or two, ma'am.
Over time, motherhood was folded seamlessly into that image, not as a private transformation, but as confirmation. The final proof that control extended beyond the screen. Photographs did most of the work, composed children, ordered rooms, a household that appeared as regulated as her career. Hollywood did not present her as a woman learning how to be a mother. It presented her as a woman completing something already understood. The label settled quickly and comfortably. Strong woman, professional, mother, each term reinforcing the others until they became interchangeable. What's notable is how complete that description felt. There was no space inside it for uncertainty, no language for adjustment, no acknowledgement that motherhood might introduce demands the role itself could not contain.
America wanted to see things in excess, and Joan Crawford was there to give it to them.
The label didn't describe how she related, it described how she functioned. And because it functioned so well, it stopped inviting explanation.
I don't think the public knows what that Oscar means to us.
Hollywood preserved this version of Joan Crawford with confidence, a figure of control, a model of professionalism, a mother whose role appeared resolved the moment it was introduced. The absence inside that certainty went unnoticed, not because it was hidden, but because nothing in the label required it to be seen.
People were in awe of her, and she was never in awe of herself. She was willing to walk up to anybody, shake hands with them.
Long before motherhood entered Joan Crawford's public life, control had already proven itself as a means of survival, not as severity, as structure. Her early years required reinvention. Stability was not inherited or assumed, it was constructed.
He wanted Barbara Stanwyck. He wanted no part of me. He said, I don't want those big, broad shoulders. I asked if I could please test. I did the test with Ann Blythe. At the end of the scene, I waited for cut, cut, cut. Nothing, no response from the director. And I looked at him. He was streaming with tears down his face. And he said, I love you, baby. I got the part.
Advancement depended on self-regulation, discipline, and the ability to present consistency in environments that offered very little margin for vulnerability. What could not be managed internally was easily punished externally. Hollywood reinforced this lesson with precision. Success followed preparation. Security followed predictability. Emotional containment was interpreted as professionalism rather than absence. Each reinforcement strengthened the same conclusion: uncertainty was dangerous, while control produced safety. Over time, this logic stopped feeling strategic and began to feel natural. Order became reassuring, not just visually but psychologically. Clear rules reduced ambiguity. Presentation minimized misinterpretation. Correction restored balance when something slipped out of alignment. This approach was visible and repeatable. Schedules were maintained meticulously. Appearances were carefully managed.
What made her a star was I worked my buns off to get here and I'm not going to lose it. And so therefore, if it meant getting dressed up to go to the market, she'd do it. If it meant giving one more interview to somebody you can't stand but is going to help the picture, she would do it.
Standards were enforced with clarity rather than negotiation. Importantly, this was not experienced as harshness. It was experienced as competence. The system responded positively to this way of operating, rewarding reliability with opportunity and consistency with trust. Each success confirmed that discipline worked, not occasionally, but repeatedly. In professional settings, this strategy functioned flawlessly. It created confidence among studios, colleagues, and executives.
She was a perfectionist.
It reduced friction in an industry defined by instability and risk. Outcomes became predictable, and predictability became currency. What formed during these years was not simply a public persona, but an internal rule. Control keeps things legible, and legibility keeps you safe. Nothing in this pattern suggested limitation. Nothing here signaled that the strategy might one day require adjustment. By every institutional measure available, the approach had already proven itself correct. So, when motherhood appeared, it entered a life already organized around a method that had never failed.
She was a disciplinarian. She wanted us to grow up independently.
Performance had been rewarded, structure had protected, and there was no precedent, personal or professional, for believing that intimacy would require a different system altogether. Motherhood entered Joan Crawford's public life as a resolved story, not as a transition, not as a beginning, as a conclusion.
I don't think anybody will truly understand Joan's relationship to her children, why she adopted them.
The adoption of her children was received as confirmation that something had come full circle. A woman who had mastered her career was now extending that mastery into domestic life. The response was immediate and affirming. Photographs circulated, profiles softened, the image appeared finished. Hollywood read this moment institutionally. Motherhood was not treated as a developing relationship, but as proof of balance.
I think she felt as a woman that she wouldn't be fulfilled if she didn't have children.
Another role integrated cleanly into an already stable system. What mattered most was how legible it was, order translated without friction, discipline reassured. Control, already familiar, simply shifted settings. There was no curiosity about adjustment, no framework for learning, no language for what might follow once the image was complete. From the system's perspective, nothing new had begun. Something had been resolved. Privately, the reality of relationship had only just started to take shape. But private reality was not what the institution was reading. The system had already decided how to interpret what it was seeing, and that interpretation left little room for revision.
Most audiences have the wrong impression of Crawford. She always portrayed a very strong, willful woman. She was not that in real life. That was performance, that was acting. She was anything but.
This was the first point of friction, not because anything went wrong, but because meaning had been assigned too quickly. Motherhood had been categorized before it had time to become anything else. For a period of time, the system had no reason to question what it was seeing. Motherhood fit neatly inside Joan Crawford's existing framework of control, order, and presentation. Nothing about the image introduced confusion or demanded reinterpretation. Children appeared composed, homes photographed well. Public appearances reinforced continuity rather than disruption. The domestic space reflected the same qualities that had defined her professional life: discipline, clarity, and restraint.
She was a very directive person and very well organized, and a damn good actress.
Hollywood values what explains itself, and this version of motherhood did exactly that. Discipline was read as care, structure was read as responsibility, consistency was read as emotional stability. The behaviors that had once ensured professional survival now translated seamlessly into domestic credibility. From an institutional standpoint, there was no visible distinction between control as a work ethic and control as parenting style.
I think around the time I was about 4, maybe 5, to say, well, I'd like it this way, or I don't want that, or I like this. And,
was she a control freak?
Yes, completely.
This alignment mattered. In an industry shaped by uncertainty, legibility functions as safety. Joan Crawford's motherhood reduced risk rather than introducing it. There were no variables to manage, no unpredictability to account for, no reason to intervene. Importantly, this acceptance did not feel constraining. It felt affirming. The system responded with trust because nothing challenged its expectations. Difference was tolerated because it remained productive.
When she got it right on camera and had the momentum going and knew her words and knew what she was doing, there was no question that you could see everything that made Joan Crawford a star.
Control was admired because it continued to work. At this stage, there was no friction, no correction, No scrutiny. The role functioned exactly as designed, and because it functioned so smoothly, there was little incentive to look beyond what was already visible. There was never a conversation that outlined what motherhood was expected to absorb, no moment where limits were discussed, no acknowledgement that the role might need to change over time. The expectations existed anyway. They lived in what went unquestioned. Motherhood, as it was understood by the system, depended on consistency, not only in care but in tone. Emotional steadiness mattered as much as visible order. The image relied on predictability, and predictability relied on silence when things became difficult to explain. What mattered most was that the role remained legible, that it continued to reassure, that it did not introduce variables the system had no interest in managing. As long as that condition was met, acceptance remained intact. What the role never accounted for was negotiation. There was no language for disagreement that did not immediately feel like disruption, no framework for emotional need that did not threaten the clarity of the image. No allowance for children whose responses might resist structure rather than absorb it. Adaptation was assumed to move in one direction only. The children would adjust to the role would not adjust to them. This assumption was never enforced explicitly. It did not require instruction. The structure itself communicated the terms. As long as order held, the relationship remained unquestioned. As long as the image stayed intact, no one asked what it required to maintain it. Importantly, this did not feel like control. It felt like normalcy. The expectations were framed as success, stability, and protection. There was no visible coercion because none was necessary. Compliance was built into the design. What went unspoken was the cost of permanence. The role was expected to remain static while the people inside it changed. Growth was not anticipated, it was deferred. Complexity was not rejected, it was simply never given a place to exist. This is how the contract functioned, not through demand, not through punishment, but through omission.
She was very headstrong and ambitious, almost maniacally ambitious, and yet she was very vulnerable.
Hollywood does not evaluate motherhood as a relationship. It evaluates it as a function. What matters to a system built on predictability is not intention, but outcome. The role must continue to reassure. It must remain legible. It must preserve the image the institution has already invested in and learned how to manage. As long as those conditions hold, the system remains comfortable. Within this logic, motherhood is not designed to evolve. It is designed to stabilize. The qualities that had once made Joan Crawford reliable discipline, control, emotional containment were rewarded because they produced consistent, visible results. The system did not distinguish between control as professionalism and control as relational method. Both appeared orderly. Both reduced uncertainty. Misalignment formed when private reality could no longer remain invisible. This did not occur because of rebellion or refusal. It occurred because relationships introduce variables that performance cannot fully absorb. Children change. Needs shift. Responses emerge that do not translate cleanly into presentation. What once functioned smoothly begins to require flexibility rather than repetition. From an institutional perspective, this was not a moral issue. It was a risk issue. Anything that complicated the image weakened predictability. Anything that demanded new language introduced uncertainty. And systems built on repetition respond to uncertainty by narrowing, not adapting. They reduce exposure rather than expand understanding. They protect what is known rather than experiment with what is unclear. Importantly, this logic operates without motive. No one needs to intend harm or exercise cruelty for misalignment to be registered. The system reads deviation mechanically. When a role no longer produces the same outcome, confidence thins. And when confidence thins, investment retreats. This retreat does not announce itself. It does not accuse. It does not explain. It simply recalibrates expectations downward. What was once trusted becomes monitored. What was once assumed becomes conditional. The system does not ask why the fit is failing. Its design does not require explanation, only adjustment. Once a role begins to demand interpretation rather than recognition, it is already at risk. This was not a judgment of Joan Crawford as a person. It was a recalculation of what the institution could no longer read clearly. Misalignment, in this sense, was inevitable. Not because anyone chose it, but because the system had never been built to accommodate change within a role it believed was already complete. The contradiction did not enter the record through confrontation. It entered through testimony. When Mommy Dearest was published, it did not arrive as a professional dispute the system knew how to manage. It did not challenge Joan Crawford's work, her discipline, or her public competence. It spoke instead about motherhood as a lived relationship rather than a completed role. From an institutional standpoint, this created a classification problem. The system understood scandal when it attached to performance. It understood controversy when it involved contracts, behavior on set, or professional conduct. It did not understand testimony that threatened a symbol without directly attacking the profession that had produced it. The issue was not whether the account could be verified or dismissed. It was that it did not fit into any category the system already possessed. There was no established language for a role that functioned publicly while failing privately.
I think Christine was very, very envious of Joan Crawford and her public and her popularity and her beauty. Very envious.
So the response narrowed. Attention shifted away from what was being described and toward who was describing it. Discussion moved from relationship to credibility, from context to character. This reframing made engagement unnecessary without requiring refutation. One change became increasingly visible over time. Joan Crawford slowly stopped being referenced as a mother at all. The image did not disappear, it contracted. What remained was the icon, disciplined, professional, untouchable. What fell outside the frame was the role that could no longer be preserved without explanation. The system did not reject the testimony outright, it simply declined to absorb it.
What was the Hollywood reaction to your story?
Oh, it was as varied as Hollywood itself.
People get mad?
Some people got mad. Some people said that it was not true. Other people defended me.
Exclusion resolved what confrontation would have complicated. Once the testimony existed, the system adjusted how it spoke and how little it needed to say. Language narrowed first, not through public statements or formal positions, but through omission. Certain descriptions stopped appearing. Certain associations were no longer repeated. What had once been discussed in relational terms was reframed through credibility. The focus shifted away from experience and toward reliability, not to argue with the account, but to make engagement unnecessary. This is how institutional interpretation works when direct resolution would introduce risk. Rather than clarifying meaning, the system reduces it. Rather than expanding language, it limits the range of what needs to be named. Motherhood, once integrated into Joan Crawford's public image, no longer required explanation. It became safer to leave the role undefined than to risk reinterpretation. Fewer words meant fewer variables, and fewer variables meant stability. Conversation thinned accordingly. Dialogue was replaced by assumption. Context was replaced by shorthand. This narrowing did not feel aggressive. It felt efficient. In professional spaces, Joan Crawford continued to be referenced through familiar terms: icon, star, professional. The qualities the system could still read clearly were preserved. What complicated that reading was quietly set aside. Over time, the absence of language did its own work. What is not named does not invite response. What is not discussed does not require resolution. By allowing certain meanings to fade without contradiction, the system protected its coherence. It avoided taking a position by declining to engage. Interpretation stabilized without ever needing to be stated. This is how authority maintains itself without confrontation, by narrowing meaning until only what reassures remains legible. What followed was not a reckoning. There was no formal reassessment of Joan Crawford's role as a mother and no reopening of the question the testimony had introduced. The system resolved the contradiction without addressing it. It did so through withdrawal. Engagement diminished gradually. Context stopped circulating. Attention shifted elsewhere without announcement. This kind of disengagement is a familiar institutional response. When confrontation would require explanation, distance becomes the more efficient option. Withdrawal avoids risk while preserving appearance. Nothing is revoked. Nothing is corrected. The system simply stops extending itself. Joan Crawford's legacy did not need defense because it was no longer being challenged directly. By allowing the contradiction to fade from active conversation, the institution maintained coherence without taking responsibility for interpretation. Absence replaced explanation. The role of motherhood, once folded neatly into her image, was no longer actively referenced. What remained visible were the elements that continued to reassure: professionalism, discipline, endurance. These qualities required no clarification and invited no dispute.
A woman who seemed very much down to earth, very simple, unpretentious, and very smart.
Over time, this silence became permanent. Not because the question had been resolved, but because it no longer needed to be addressed. Time compression, decades passed without the question ever being reopened. In this way, withdrawal completed the process that language had begun. The system did not collapse under contradiction. It outlasted it. What disappeared was not the icon. It was the context that made the contradiction visible in the first place. Joan Crawford remains fixed in public memory as strength, discipline, and professionalism. An icon who mastered her craft and endured one of Hollywood's most demanding eras. Motherhood survives in that memory as well, but only in its most simplified form, as presentation, as completion, as a role that appears resolved the moment it is introduced. What does not survive is context. The complexity that challenged the image is no longer central to how the story is told. It exists at the margins, treated as peripheral rather than structural. This is not a verdict on Joan Crawford, and it is not an argument about truth. It is an illustration of how systems remember. Institutions preserve what reassures them. They repeat what remains legible. They narrow meaning until contradiction no longer requires response. In this process, symbols endure while relationships disappear. Roles survive while the conditions that sustained them are erased. Joan Crawford's legacy remains intact because it is easy to hold. What becomes difficult to hold is what the image could not accommodate and therefore no longer needed to remember. Final question: what kind of system requires love to be legible only as performance, and what must it leave out in order to keep that requirement intact?